Budlander, and I want to put on record that there was an application for leave to cross-examine Colonel Scott from the Mr. Bezos' clients, and that's essentially the attorneys for the Ledingwani family, and 5 topics were indicated in the application. I disallowed 2. The 2 I allowed were to test the version of the police service against expert evidence, including that of Mr. Hendricks, Dr. Perumal, and Dr. Naidu. And the second was to explore the appropriateness of the appointment and/or selection of Colonel Scott and certain of his colleagues to be responsible for developing the operational strategy of the SAPS during the Marikana operation. It was indicated that a period of 1 day would be required, but in the light of the fact that I disallowed 3 of the topics, Mr. Bezos has assured me that the cross-examination should take a much shorter period than that. There was a list of documents which would be relied on, most of which have now fallen away in the light of the decision I've taken. Anyway, the matter has been discussed with Mr. Semenya, who indicated that he is satisfied with the procedures so far. In relation to perhaps to other witnesses, we must work out as a more formal procedure to combine an endeavour to use the time we have as efficiently as we can. On the other hand, not to do so at the expense of unfairness to any of the parties. We have in the past said, and I want to reaffirm this, that when a witness is to be cross-examined, we expect the witness to be informed in advance, or the party calling the witness to be informed in advance of statements and documents that can be relied on, so the witness has an opportunity to read them beforehand. It saves time and also promotes fairness. If there are new documents that are not previously before the Commission, then obviously we require copies, but it's no good just saying it's a document that's before the Commission, because that's in effect saying there's a needle somewhere in the haystack of the many thousands of pages that are before the Commission, and we're going to refer to that needle. Well, that's not fair to the witness either. But that is not a problem in relation to the cross-examination which the Colonel is now going to be subjected to. You're still under oath, Colonel? Mr. Bezos?
Yes. Chairperson.
Anything you want to add?
Chairperson, sorry, I meant to put something on record at the end of the cross-examination and did not do so. Chairperson, you will have seen that we pre-numbered our exhibits in the Triple J series. And in the course of the cross-examination, there were some exhibits that weren't put formally to Colonel Scott. We've spoken to our colleagues at SAPS, and they have given their consent for a proposal which we would like to make, which is that all of those exhibits in the Triple J series go in as exhibits, including the exhibits that weren't put to Colonel Scott. They'll go in under cover of a filing sheet which will describe the documents. And exhibits which haven't or weren't put to Colonel Scott will have no greater status than a document that has been described by the evidence leaders in the terms of the cover sheet. But it will enable other parties to have access to these documents as exhibits, and they can then be referred to later as by the exhibit number that everyone will have recognized them by.
Yes, thank you. And while we're talking about documents, I would like to remind Mr. Semenya that at one stage he told us that we would be receiving a document from the police setting out lessons that have been learnt, aspects that are being considered for the future, defects and so on, of which they're aware. He did indicate that he said that document was being prepared. I take it that as soon as it's ready, it will be given to us.
Indeed, Chair, and the remarks made by Mr. Chaskalson are with a caveat that we would have an opportunity to contest any of the evidentiary content of those exhibits where we deem appropriate.
Yes, I'm sure you accept that.
Absolutely. I should have mentioned that caveat. We have no problem with it, and it was agreed.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Scastos, we've now reached the stage, I think, when you can start your cross-examination.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel, do you consider yourself an expert on the management of gatherings?
No, sir.
No. You've had an opportunity of reading the statements of Mr. Hendricks and Mr. White. Have you?
Some time back, I read Mr. Hendricks' statement. Mr. White's statement more recently, yes.
Yes, you in fact supplemented after having read those statements certain aspects of your original statement. Is that correct?
I produced a consolidated statement. It's not in reflection of reading statements of Mr. Hendricks or Mr. White. It was at the request of the evidence leaders to produce a statement which was more comprehensive to what my experience was at that time.
You agree that the two persons, Mr. Hendricks and Mr. White, are experts on the management of gatherings?
I'm not sure as to how one would classify if there's a specific measurement tool of how you would classify an expert, but I do acknowledge that I have got a lot of experience in those fields, yes.
Well, you know that experts are people who have studied and have experience in relation to the matter in issue. Do you accept the statements of both Mr. Hendricks and Mr. White that they have wide experience in the management of gatherings?
I accept that within the areas of the world that they come from, yes.
In the what?
Within their areas of responsibility in the countries that they originate from, yes.
Well, I'll come to the question of the country in a moment, but do you agree that they are critical of of what you say in your statement about the management of the crowd at Marikana? Do you agree that they are critical?
They have delivered critique, yes, on the operational plan, yes.
Not being an expert, you are not able to contradict their opinions placed before the Commission.
I think it's just that their opinions are their opinions. I can only testify to what I experienced on ground, what I did at the time of Marikana.
I don't know why you say their opinions are their opinions. The question is, are you able to contradict the opinions and conclusions that these two experts, that you acknowledge as experts, are wrong?
No, Chair. Chair, I think the question demands some specificity. Which opinion, so that we know what we're talking about?
The question is overbroad, as the constitutional lawyers would say.
Mr. Chairman, if I have to enumerate and go through the details of the matters on which they contradict the witness's statement, will be a long time. He has read them. He knows what is contradicted. Let me give an example. The obedience of the stand-in orders, for instance.
It's also rather wide because the standing orders cover a wide field, but I would imagine, if I may give you my reaction to it, conceded he's not an expert in public order policing. So there may be a number of views expressed by experts in public order policing about which he can say, I can't deal with the matter because I'm not an expert in that field. But there may be matters covered by their reports, which, in respect to which he can give evidence, not necessarily of an expert nature, but of a factual nature, that they raise this criticism, and they may do it from the background of their expertise, but I can, from my own experience, tell you that this is why I did what I did, and the criticism they make isn't justified in the light of my explanation. He can certainly deal with the points in that way. I understand the difficulty is if you call a heart surgeon and he gives expert evidence on matters of heart surgery, you can't expect an ordinary lay witness, even a lay witness who was perhaps assisting as a nurse in the operation, to deal with the expert opinions expressed by the heart surgeon. But there are matters covered in the heart surgeon's evidence which a non-expert person participating in the operation can deal with. So I think that's the distinction we must bear in mind, isn't it?
Well, let's take one example, that in their opinion, the persons that you chose to put to control, or not to control is your language, management with R4s and R5s is completely contrary to the principles of the management of crowds. Do you agree with that?
The operation was, in essence, dealt into two environments. There was a public order drive, which was an offensive public order movement of dispersion, and that was done with less than lethal force. What was to follow that was the arresting of belligerent protesters, which was falling outside the ambit of the public order action. And that had to do with dangerous arrests.
Sorry, no, Mr. Bezos, give him an opportunity to finish his answer before asking the follow-up question.
And the initial tasking of those that were to follow, who were armed with sharp-point ammunition, was to go ahead with their expert skills, which they have through their training, to carry out high-risk arrests of belligerent and armed protesters, not necessarily always armed with firearms, but also armed with pangas and the like, as they would find in their day-to-day jobs when they do high-risk arrests on behalf of detectives, crime intelligence, etc. And that's the rationale behind using them, as well as obviously as a protection in the case of life-threatening circumstances for those who are only armed with less than lethal force, trying to come up against potentially lethal force in the manner of either firearms or pangas in close proximity and spears.
Their opinion is that the use of force by persons not trained in the operation of dealing with management of gathering, putting people trained to shoot, to kill, are not the appropriate people to engage. Do you agree with that?
No, as I've said, the operation that I planned was split into two specific sectors of operation.
Do you disagree with their conclusion that it is contrary to the principles of managing gatherings?
The gathering, the dispersion action to deal with the gathering was dealt with by public order policing in the plan, as per SOP.
You qualify that having regard to the countries that they come from.
Before we carry on, there are specific passages in the statements of Mr. Hendricks and Mr. White, upon which you are basing these questions. I think it might be fair to the witness to indicate, you don't have to indicate all the paragraph numbers, but there are sections in the report where these topics are dealt with. The report of Mr. White, for example, is divided up into a number of discrete topics. So it would be helpful, I think, if you referred him to that. But his answer, as I understand it, is I took two factors into account. There were the public order aspects, in respect to which I had people who were going to use less than lethal force. But there were other problems which went beyond this public order policing, dealing with dangerous people armed with dangerous weapons, and I dealt with those differently. That's his answer. And I think that's the distinction he's trying to draw. Whether it's a valid one may be a matter of argument, but that's the point he's trying to make, I think. Am I correct, Colonel?
That's correct. correct, Chairperson.
Well, we will put, if need be, in due course, the specific passages that we are relying on, which question the validity of your opinion and your organization of this police activity. But you mentioned having regard to the countries that they come from. Do you think that an important factor?
Well, as I say, the way that South Africa is emerging from a past that it's had into a new thriving democracy, I don't know if we can be squared away initially with how Britain, or for that matter Belgium, would deal with rights in the same way. I'm not sure that their rights are always initially as violent as ours can be.
I think as far as Britain is concerned, Mr. White's experience was confined to Ulster, in Northern Ireland, where he dealt, according to his statement, dealt over a number of years with problems involving the IRA and kind of civil disturbances they had in Northern Ireland. As far as Mr. Hendricks was concerned, he wasn't only talking from his Belgian experience, experience as I understand him elsewhere in the world, particularly experience in South Africa, where he worked for some years, according to his summary, with the SAPS. So it's not just, it's not just Britain and Belgium that we're busy with. But anyway, I'm interfering with Mr. Bezos' cross-examination. I'm sorry.
You've heard from the chairperson of the background of these people, and it's not necessary for me to put it to you again. But what I am concerned about is that you chose to say that their experience and the expression of their opinion doesn't apply or ought not to be taken fully into consideration because they haven't got the South African experience. Is that what you meant?
That is true.
That is true. And you still believe that?
That is my opinion, yes.
You know, Colonel, are you aware of paragraph 1.1 of the standing orders issued in 2004?
Standing order, there are hundreds of standing orders. Which one?
SS2.
Standing Order 262, Chairperson.
Standing Order General 262, which is double S2. Are you aware of the first paragraph of that?
Chair, if the witness does not have the document, may we ask that it be flighted, that specific paragraph?
Your request has already been anticipated and it's on the screen.
It out. It's only 2.5 lines, Mr. Chairman. Listen, Colonel. The purpose of this order is to regulate crowd management during gatherings and demonstrations in accordance with the democratic principles of the Constitution and acceptable international standards. Did you know that?
I see it there, and I agree with that.
You agree with it? You think that it doesn't apply to the South African police?
No.
I think he said that, but let's give him an opportunity to say what he does mean.
Ask him, Mr. Chairman.
Us as the South African Police Service are striving to be in line with other first world police services. We also ascribe to human rights. We also try to police as best as possible in those ways. The opinions that I was lifting again was that I'm not sure that the crowds dealt with at all times, for instance in Britain, may always be relevant to the crowds dealt with in South Africa, not to the principles that the South African police were described to.
The democratic principles of the Constitution place very high value on the sanctity of human life.
I agree.
In any plan that may be devised,
I agree, and that's taken into account.
that must not only be borne in mind, but must be obeyed.
It was borne in mind when the plan was conceived.
Well, was it borne in mind that led to the result of 34 dead and over 80 seriously wounded?
The result of what happened there that day is not necessarily the result of the plan that I put forward. It's individual actions that it takes to pull a trigger. And that needs to be a question put to each individual that pulled the trigger, whether they were acting within the ambits of self-defense, private defense for that matter. Because that was the briefing to them.
Once you talk about self-defense, do you accept the fact that 34 people, demonstrators, died, approximately 8 were seriously wounded, and do you accept that self-defense must be proportionate?
Self-defense must always be proportionate, but as I say, we're not talking to the acts of the police members that acted versus the plan. It's not to say that the people that pulled the trigger are acting in accordance with what the plan was. That perception that they had at that time with their experience needs to be testified to, which I can't do, by every member that pulled this trigger, to justify the case of pulling the trigger in self-defense.
Where is the proportionality when there was not a single policeman with a scratch, as against the 34 deaths and the approximately 8 seriously wounded? Where is the proportionality, Colonel?
That needs to be weighed up by the evidence of the members that were in the line, because the proportion...
The questions of proportionality, as the witness says, have to be testified to.
Raise your voice,
The question of proportionality, as the witness says, would have to be testified by those who pull the trigger. It's not for the planner to testify on self-defense.
My learned friend is wrong. With a great respect, we have already handed in a short memorandum that I want him to remind my learned friend of, that part of the function of the Commission is to report on the responsibility of the persons that were involved. I submit with respect that those who planned, those who adopted the plan, those who purported to execute it, we will submit are all responsible and will quote authority for that proposition in due course.
I understand that submission you make, but you're not addressing the witness now in support of your argument. You're busy questioning him. The proposition you're putting to him deals with proportionality. It relates to the actions taken by individual members of the service who were physically responsible, whether they were legally responsible, the matter will be debated later, for the deaths of 34 people. He says he wasn't one of them. He had a plan. It depends upon each particular person who fired a shot, and not him personally. That's his answer. I don't know how much further you can take that, but that's his answer.
Take it further, Mr. Chairman. You are the one who selected the people that were trained to shoot to kill and put our 4s and our 5s with 4,000 live bullets in their hands, and you were part of the planning of the action. And do you feel that you are responsible, or that you are completely blameless for this?
I'm responsible for placing of police officials who have the tactics and the skills to be standing in a line, and they have the legal training within the police to understand that they only utilize those firearms in order to save life. So again, it comes down to the test of why they shot the shot. But my planning for them to be there was one of high-risk arrest. And a police person only responds to a threat against himself or against another. He does not respond as a military person or as a soldier where he is tasked to go out to take life. He goes out in essence to save life. And if it's necessary to take a life to save a life, then that is part of the call of duty which he is expected to carry out.
Colonel, you prepared Exhibit L.
Explained to us that he was a co-author of it, but there were a number of other
Yes.
inputs, and some of the changes that were made at a late stage, he doesn't appear to be...
We are not unmindful of all that, but you played an important part in putting Exhibit L together, which is an exoneration of all the people that may have participated in the planning, in the execution, in the...
Mr. Peter, sorry to interrupt you. Is that a statement or a question? It sounds to me like a double question. The logical question first is, do you agree with that L's an exoneration? If he says yes, you take it further, but you can't build the statement into the question and expect him to answer two things at once.
Well, you've heard the question that, part of the question that I put, but limited, justifiably so with respect, by the chairman. Will you please answer the question?
I don't believe Exhibit L was put together to try to exonerate the police. From my understanding, it was put together at that stage with the limited material we had, the inputs that we could get from the police members through their commanders to provide a foundation to kickstart the commission.
Well, we will come to the Exhibit L in due course. Now, is Brigadier Mkunazi, that has given evidence in this case, an expert on the management of crowds?
Again, I'm not sure what the measuring staff is to accept whether one would be an expert.
Well, let me read to you his evidence. He was being cross-examined by Mr. Motau.
Are you reading his evidence to him or dealing with his expertise? When you put to the witness that, asked him whether he accepts that the Brigadier Mkunazi is an expert, he said he doesn't know exactly what the basis for his being an expert or not is. That's not his word, it's mine. If you're going to deal with that, fine, but don't just jump to the next question without having got an answer to the previous one, to whether he accepts the Brigadier's expertise. As far as I remember, he was involved in training people who were involved with public order policing. So it sounds, and he had substantial training in that field himself. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been put in charge of the training. So it sounds as if he's an expert, but unless you have a question about it.
To my knowledge, Chairperson, he was...
Mr. Mkunazi is a coordinator of the training.
To my recollection, and obviously I stand to be corrected now, I know that he originated from a public order policing unit as his junior years in the police, so he would have some experience on the ground. But I think that when he became an officer, he moved into different environments. Specifically, at one stage, he was the skills development facilitator of our division, which is not a POPs. He simply facilitates all the skills that come in from the different environments and forwards them to our division training for budgets and that, which he did for a number of years before he was transferred to the Northern Cape as the ORS representative on that side. And this is why I say, where do we draw the line with regards to experience, training, etc. And he has a fair share of training knowledge in the operational commanders training, which I think he presented for some time as well. Same course that I actually did as well.
He was at the meeting where Exhibit L was put together.
I remember seeing him there from time to time. I'm not sure if he was not there the full time now.
He gave evidence before the commission.
Yes, I understand so.
He was called by counsel for the commission.
I understand he was at the commission.
Sorry, I thought he was called by counsel for the police.
That's correct, as a feeler.
Yes. Let me come to the substance. He was asked, Brigadier, let me return to the aspects that I intend to deal with you.
The page reference.
I'm sorry,
So
Mr. Chairman.
the others here can follow.
Transcript, page 3498.
Thank you.
Brigadier, let me return to the aspect that I intend to deal with you. I'd like firstly start with discussing certain aspects emanating from Standing Order 262, which is an Annexure SS. Sorry, yeah, Annexure SS2, Brigadier Makanazi. I've got it, sir, Mr. Motawesi. I gathered from your evidence, and correct me if I am wrong, that the operation such as the one in Marikana is the kind of an operation to which the Standing Order was applicable. Am I correct? Brigadier Mkanazi, correct. The chairman, transcript on page 3564. Chairperson, before Mr. Nsebenza asks the next question, can I ask you a question? You said that it relates to a point he's asked already. You said there should have been a pop operation. Brigadier Maknazi. Correct, sir, Chairperson. There should have been a pop operation commander, as in fact there was. Correct? It was. Chairperson. Now, the plan that was drawn up, should that have been drawn up by a pop person with pop expertise? Brigadier Muknazi, that's correct. Do you agree with Brigadier Muknazi in his answers to particularly put by the chairman, or do you disagree?
There are a number of questions he was asked, and he was obviously answering in line with Standing Order 262. And the reply I've got to that is that there was a strategy in place which involved public order. It also involved other tactical units. And to have the public order member, in essence, planning for the tactical units would also be unprecedented. This is why there was a JOCOM, where all were represented. The plan that was, or the strategy that was devised, was laid before the JOCOM, which had the senior POPs members there, in order to give their POPs advice in relation to what they understood from their standard operating procedures. How the operation was managed is not obviously at my level when it comes to regards to overall commanders and the like, which you would find in Standing Order 262.
Do you agree or disagree with the opinion expressed by Mr. Mukanazi?
I think it's a limited opinion.
I beg your pardon?
I believe it's limited. I don't believe that Brigadier Makanazi necessarily had all the time to have all the materials in front of him that, for instance, a Mr. White or Mr. Hendricks has had.
He was at Potch.
I had to fly to Pretoria.
Was he called because of his experience as a police expert on the management of gatherings?
I can't testify as to who called him or why they called him. But the question that you asked, he was at Potch. He was sporadically at Potch.
I can't resist the temptation of responding to your suggestion that there was somebody at the time that the deaths occurred 3 kilometers away, and he was an expert. But we'll come to that.
What I maybe need to explain is that the strategy dealt with a public order policing strategy. When we look at going into dialogue, in line with Standing Order 262, when we look at moving to a show of force, in line with Standing Order 262, when we look at the tactical option employed, it became a dual tactical option, one to deal with the crowds, one to deal with dangerous arrest situations. Moving to phase 4, that is not a public order responsibility to deal with crime scenes and to deal with evidence. Phase 5, also not public order, responsibility to go and do high-risk arrests inside of houses and retrieving of evidence. Phase 6, again, moving to a public order planned operation under the cordon and search.
Every time you give a long explanation, another question arises, Colonel. You say that the matter was different, at a different stage. The question, though, is that the properly trained person should have been there in order to manage. And when you say that the use of force, or rather the threat of force and the responses to the threat of force, the experts that have given evidence on paper say that a show of force may be counterproductive. Do you agree with them, or do you disagree with them?
This is why the operation does not start with a show of force. And we would be...
Agree with them?
No, Mr. Bezos, give them an opportunity to answer the question.
This is why the operation starts with a forward holding area where the reserve forces that are not necessary for the protection of a monitoring, which is the monitoring is in effect a protection for the negotiator group, is in the front line towards a sizable crowd. So minimal, that we thought at the time, forces were pushed forward to where the crowd was, while the bulk of the forces were kept at the reserve holding area, which is actually the forward holding area. So that is phase 1. In other words, not to go to that. And again, if I say that a show of force is something that should not happen, then I'm in contradiction again with our own standing order, which advises that you need to move to a show of force to dissuade violent action from protesters.
In principle, do you disagree or agree with the two experts that at times the show of force is counterproductive?
They are correct that there are times when it is counterproductive, and there are times when it is necessary.
Was there a POPs commander at 1330, at the 1330 meeting, when they dealt with phase 3 intervention? Was there such a person?
Just say which commander?
The question again, Mr. Bezos, I'm afraid I didn't understand it properly, but it's probably my fault. Repeat it again, please.
Yes. There was was there a POPs commander at the 1330 meeting when it was decided to intervene in terms of phase 3?
No.
No. So the vital question was also taken without the advice of a POPs trained management person.
That is the fact, but the fact is that General Mpembe was the overall commander. Your operational commander at this time was in the field dealing with the very phase 2, which was part of the public order strategy.
Where was he when phase 3 was?
He was still in the field at his post.
He
was still in the field at his post. That's being Brigadier Karlitz, who was the operational commander. General Mpembe, being the overall commander, was present in the JOCOM at that time.
Now, you yourself chose in paragraph 6 of your statement, G39, to say the following. It starts with neither the crowd management, Mr. Chairman.
3 lines from the foot of the page.
Paragraph 6, Mr. Chairman.
It's the 5th line, in case the pages, as we see them on the screen, are not paginated. It's the 5th line of para 6.
Yes. May I read it out, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, we have it on the screen, and in fact, we see the pagination, so we can see the 3rd line from the foot. Neither the crowd management. Read it, Mr. Bezos.
Neither the crowd management strategies for which Standing Order 262 provides, nor the hostage management strategies were appropriate in isolation. I thus had to devise what I considered at the time to be an appropriate plan for an unprecedented situation, being one which had to encompass the principles of Standing Order 262, but moving beyond the restrictions of the Standing Order to effectively plan for the disarming of the protesters while in the area when dealing with a belligerent, while considering the protection of the police officials and the community in the area dealing with a belligerent armed group numbering up to 3,000 people who were choosing to contest the request to disperse and or disarm, demonstrating a clear defiance towards the law and the enforcers of the law with aggressive action should they be approached, as demonstrated on the 13th of August 2012. Are those your words?
Yes, sir.
Bezos, when you reach an appropriate stage, we'll take the tea adjournment, but if you want to round this point off before we do that, please proceed.
It's a convenient stage, Mr. Chairman.
We'll take the tea adjournment at this stage. I hope we'll all be back in a quarter of an hour. As he used was move beyond the restrictions. You use his own language, even this is
use your own language. Yes, yes. Which version did you rely on?
Are we on the language issue or back to the 3,000?
1,000 or 300?
One has to anticipate, and I say this now because we were fully aware of the militant group, and that was a concern to us. So that was an identification, it was a risk that we saw on its own. You don't know the intentions of the rest, and I think it's also clear, because I'm not saying this is the case, but it would seem from some of the photos that beyond only the militant group that we assumed to be about 300, it seems that others did follow suit behind them. So in anticipation of an operation, you would always look towards anticipating a worse scenario than you would need be. In other words, if we needed to go forwards to disperse 3,000 people, that was what the POPs were going to go and do. But there was a special cognizance taken that there was this group of 300. So both are correct. We knew there was 3,000. We didn't understand their attitude fully, but we knew the attitude of the 300, which was shown to be militant. And also from the history of the Monday, it seemed to be a similar group.
I don't want to debate it with you in detail. Were you aware of the provisions of the Article 7, particularly 7.2 and 3C and 9.1 and 11.2 and the steps that have to be taken in terms of it, and 11.5 and 12.2, all of which...
Referring to the Standing Order 262, I take it. Are you?
Standing Order numbers, yes.
Yes.
There are quite a number, but they have something in common. That if you are to deviate from any action in relation to what is expected by the orders, proper warnings have got to be given. Will you accept that from me? I don't want to read all of them onto the record.
I think you've named a number of paragraphs, which was too fast for me to actually try to work through as you were going, but I agree it is a principle within crowd management operations that before you're about to take any offensive action, you warn the crowd of your intention, because you want to allow those that are not willing to be confronted by an offensive operation from public order policing at own to move away. Because anybody who chooses to stay then has accepted that the police are going to exercise what they've said they're going to do and is prepared to withstand that and thus needs to take the brunt of what's coming to them. But it's in all fairness that before you do an offensive action, you do need to warn the crowd, yes.
Do you accept that no warnings were given about the shooting? That if you don't submit or dissociate yourself, then there will be shooting to kill you? Was any such warning given?
There was no
at any stage?
There was no such order that I'm aware of, but what I'd like to say is that the closing off of the razor wire was a defensive action, and there's no need to pre-warn a crowd of a defensive action. The warning of the offensive action, which would have been the dispersion on part of POPs, would have been given once the POPs force was in place to do so. So that never materialized due to the fact that the police felt that they came under a threat, and they responded immediately to the threat. Thus, no warning could be issued necessarily to that crowd at that time because they were trying to repel the crowd from coming towards the police line itself.
That is presupposed on the version of the police, which has been put in dispute and would appear to be not correct, the police version, having regard to the recent disclosures of footage.
I'm not sure which part is predisposed, but we do know that the public order personnel and all other forces involved were going out to carry out the plan. In phase 1 of that plan, it was disrupted due to the actions of the strikers. So they never got to the position where Brigadier Carlitz would have addressed them and told them the intentions of the police.
Well, where were you when the shooting took place?
Inside the jock.
How far away from the scene?
What's that, 4 kilometers?
4 kilometers. Would you give us a list of the people there?
You know I can't do that.
Huh?
Obviously, I can't recall every person that was there by.
Because we've had that. I mean,
Yes,
the scope is quite
they
fully
are,
in
they
Mr.
are
Chaskalson.
enumerated. There are 9 of them.
Yeah, and we get them, I think, from the minutes of the meeting at 1:30.
Yeah.
Yes,
we don't have to.
So I don't think we have to cover that again.
And is that where you were when you heard that there were 8?
So, as pointed out to you, of course, it doesn't follow that all the people listed at the 1:30 meeting were there later, because one, for example, the provincial commissioner left, and the witness doesn't know when she came back. And Pembe left to go in a helicopter, but it's quite. I think we can work out quite easily in the light of the evidence we have already who were there. I don't know. We have to traverse that now, unless there's some important. The presence of some particular person is important for the questions you're going to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The people that were there when you heard that 18 people were dead on the ground.
No, Chair, that's not the evidence. There was no communication in the joke that 18 people were dead.
See, part of the evidence is that they only heard at 4:20. That was traversed in the cross-examination of Mr. Chaskalson. One of the matters we'd have to decide at the end of the day is at what time some of the people in the jock knew that people had been shot and were down. But that's been covered also already, you know. So unless there's some particular point that is relevant to your present line,
whoever may have been there, and whether they were lying on the ground or that they had been shot and may have been seriously wounded. What was your reaction?
I continued to listen to the radio.
What was your reaction to that statement?
If you're asking what my understanding was, my reaction was I continued to listen to the radio. My understanding was that before that, message had come through from Colonel Vermaak. The radio conversation I can recall before that was Brigadier Carlitz directing what you could hear was a public order operation because he was specifically talking to Papa call signs, he was speaking to water cannons, and he was continually giving the command engage. So it was a bit difficult to try and understand at the moment because it's as though we just jumped straight into the operation and we thought that he'd possibly gone ahead and started with the dispersal action.
I would have expected you to say...
Sorry, I think he was going to say something else before you started to ask your question. Am I correct, Colonel? You were
Yes,
going to add something.
But in response to Colonel Vermaak's report, and as I say, I think I recall him actually counting or getting to a number and then counting a little bit further as to what he could see and saying bodies lying on the ground and tying that back to hearing what we thought was a dispersal action being carried out by Brigadier Carlitz. my response to that would have been, well, that's part of the dispersal that's going on. There's no lethal force being applied there. And if there was, one would have, as I've testified before, expected that somebody would have said over the radio, this is what's happened, there's been a shooting, but that was never relayed that I heard standing in the jock.
Did you say to the others at the jock meeting, this is completely unacceptable and unexpected. Let us rush in order to avoid any further shooting or deaths?
Because the question is not clear to me. I don't know. There are 2 points that I think have to be clarified before the witness can answer. The first is what you mean by this, and secondly, at what time you're talking about. Did he think this at 4 o'clock? Did he think it at 20 past 4, 4:30? And what is it that is the this that was unacceptable? That's the point of your question. I think you must clarify those 2 points before you can expect him to answer.
Was it acceptable to the people there present, whatever time it may have been, that there should be 18 bodies lying in the ground?
If you're talking about the report of the bodies lying on the ground, to my knowledge, I can't speak for the others in the jock, that was not carried over to me or perceived by me as being people that were dead or wounded with sharp point ammunition. So that the operation continued was also difficult to try to perceive because there was the sporadic talking of Brigadier Carlitz, and we know now in hindsight and through videos what was actually transpiring, but at that stage you're trying to form a mental picture of exactly what the words are meaning and trying to engage in your mind where they could be on ground at this time or that they're a reorganized line. So with the operation continuing, you're assuming that it's happening according to plan at this time.
Was it part of the plan that there should be 8 people lying on the ground?
I think it's
was it foreseen?
I didn't foresee that, but as I just want to state that you will find in public order operations, when rubber is used and so on, there are people that run and there are those that will go and lie down, for instance, and they could have been placed under arrest for that matter at the same time, because when a policeman is going to arrest somebody, the safest place for someone is then to place them on the ground to lie flat, because you have control of them in that way.
When did you hear for the first time, at what time, if it's so relevant, that at least 18 people had been killed?
That was the latter part of, I think it was post 420, even, as I say, I heard that in the jock. I can't put a specific time to that. It's not something that I specifically looked at my watch and said.
20, you say?
Any time from then, possibly on. Because I was listening to the radio as far as I could go. One of the last reports I can remember hearing was Colonel Gaffley saying ceasefire.
When you did hear, did you realize that whatever your plan may have been, something very seriously wrong had taken place?
I can't say that I would consider something seriously wrong had taken place. In my mind's eye, according to how I had planned, the only time that a policeman would use his firearm with live ammunition would be in defense of his life or that of another. I did expect that there would be some form of resistance from the militant group. And that struck me as possible. A similar attack as what happened to the police on Monday had been tried again on the police on the Thursday, and that the police had defended themselves. So that was my understanding at the time, once I did learn that there were casualties.
Say that the crowd management strategies were inappropriate for the situation at Marikana. What did you mean by that?
To bring about the holistic mission, which was to restore stability in all aspects. Crowd management, in essence, on its own, was not going to deliver that result.
Can you explain how the group of strikers at Marikana differed from other large crowds to which the precepts of Standing Order 262 do apply?
Again, I can only speak for myself, but my understanding was the history that I was given from the Monday incident, and what I was told was that the police had tried to take a tactical option of public order policing measures against the crowd, who had turned and retaliated. And this is where it becomes unprecedented, because previously crowds may throw rocks and move away, but never to the point where they actually go with intent to murder and to take the arms and the ammunition and the radios from the police officials that they've killed and move off with that. Even the taking of those weapons from the policemen shows that they was moving to a new level, not simply just a retaliation on a policeman, but the theft of the armament of that policeman, or those policemen for that matter. So moving into the Marikana operation, I was aware of that the strikers had seemed to have moved to a level which is not necessarily experienced in labor dispute. I know it has been possibly experienced before in political dispute, but not in labor dispute. And this was something that was causing a labor dispute to become unprecedented, where strikers would go to those levels to actually turn on the authority of the state and consciously take life, steal weapons, and move off with that. We were in another environment of the level of violence that we were dealing with.
The behavior of the crowd on Tuesday and Wednesday was peaceful.
It was, and I attribute that to the fact that the police brought the hope of dialogue, that the protesters thought, well, the police will surely then bring mine management out to speak to them, which was not going to be the case. The police was not there to get involved in a labor dispute. We were there to dialogue and negotiate the security of the area and to bring and restore stability. In other words, for them to leave peacefully and to return the arms, or leave them behind and move off without them.
And on a substantial body of evidence, they continue behaving peacefully on Thursday morning.
Yes, they did. But as we understand, there was a pledge given, and I speak from hearsay. It was told to us in the JOC that they had stated they would disperse, disarm, etc. I admittedly found that a little far-fetched, but I believe that even at that time, Mr. Matunjwa had given them hope that there would still be some form of intervention from mine management side, and they were prepared to still hold back from violence because of Mr. Matunjwa's proposition of hope to get them their 12,500 rand.
Would you agree, as Mr. Hendricks says, that flashpoints or disorder in a crowd can be triggered by sudden or over-dramatic police intervention which suggests overkill? Give you a preference, G2, paragraph 14.3. Do you agree with that?
I agree that that is the case, that there are crowd control situations or crowd public order gatherings where if the police does something which is unanticipated by the crowd, it can cause emotions to rise, etc. Thus, the communication before the police would make any radical move towards an offensive movement towards the crowd. Again, strategically, this is why defensive movements do not need to be communicated, because they're in essence just that. It's a prevention measure being put in place against a crowd which is being anticipated to want to carry out some form of harm or moving to an area where they have not been permitted to move towards.
Mr. Hendricks also says that psychological shock tactics to promote submission through a rapid and overwhelming presence of STF members in tactical gear utilizing indirect assertive verbal team commands combined with the visual stimulation of professional tactically clad officers to dissuade any offensive action from the perpetrator. I'm sorry, that is your statement and not Mr. Hendricks. Is that your belief?
It is, and it's one of what I felt at the time would help dissuade any further violent action or any further mobilizing of the group or consideration of the group. And I think it's a logical process in the mind of a human being that if you're shown a show of force, that you would need to weigh up whether you are still going to contemplate carrying out an illegal action when there is a force of that magnitude that is within an area to help to prevent that illegal action from happening.
What Mr. Hendricks says, if public order will be more disturbed by intervention than by doing nothing, then it is better to opt for another solution to the problem, including standing back and doing nothing, or postponing the operation, the principle of situational appropriateness. Do you agree with Mr. Hendricks or not?
I do agree there are times that is applicable, and one would look to certain minor illegal activities that may occur during the march, where if you would address the crowd or try to move in onto the crowd because of minor illegal activities, it could spark a more violent reaction. But that's not necessarily applicable now to a situation as we were facing at the Marikana at that time.
Mr. Hendricks has also said that before considering repressive offensive action, POP commanders should consider both the advantage they are counting on and the negative outcome for public order. If one is considering a repressive offensive action with the sole aim of making people obey the law and not with the protection of persons and property, it will only be possible to justify this intervention in exceptional circumstances, the principle of minimization. This is to be found in Mr. Hendricks' statement at page 8 of his statement. Do you agree with that?
I think that the key words there, exceptional situation, to which he says that, and I think we can agree with our dispute that Marikana was an exceptional situation looking at the preceding day's history and what the South African police, as the authority of the state, was needing to deal with there. This was not something that was simply going to die down, and at some stage the police needed to act in order to restore the law and order to the area.
Your response in your statement on paragraph 624.3.
Which of the exhibits are you referring to?
It's on exhibit triple H20, Mr. Chairman.
Paragraph 620?
624.3.
Page 26 of exhibit triple H20.
Yes.
Perhaps they can put.
There are two passages.
Perhaps that can be put up. So that,
yes. As a last resort.
Well, shouldn't we wait till it's put on the screen?
Yeah.
Page 26 of exhibit triple H20. You can see that is the the statement which is on the screen, but it's the wrong paragraph. What we need is para 624.3.
Resort. Second line. As a last resort.
No, we've got to go a little bit further. At the moment we've got 6.19. Let's just move on a little bit to 6.24.3. There we've got the last resort, yes. It's the second line of that paragraph. As a last resort, compliance with the law must be enforced through a force continuum.
Which needs to be proportionate to the threat posed. Do you agree with that?
It's my wording, and we need to put it in context. What I'm speaking to here, in essence, are the principles of policing. That in any police confrontation, or where a police van is called out, there are steps that you would go through in principle to try to resolve a situation.
Now, it's the matter of concern that you believed that compliance with the law must be enforced. What law did you have in mind?
Again, I'm speaking here, if you go back to paragraph 6.24. The
question is, what law did you have in mind?
I'm speaking to the principles in the statement I'm speaking to here, which are applied later to the fact that the demonstration or the gathering that's happening at the Kopi is illegal, in fact, because of it being represented by strikers who are armed, which is in contravention with what the Constitution is saying, with their right to protest, to picket, etc. And notwithstanding...
What law did they contravene?
Being part of a gathering where they are armed. They needed to be dispersed from that. And at the same time, crime intelligence was also acting on, as best as they could, video footage, etc., to try to lift out perpetrators, possible perpetrators, from the Monday issue, to also get to the point where the arrests through the detectives could be made with regard to the murders that had been made. So there were a number of aspects which had to be dealt with at the end of the day, of laws which had been broken over the days preceding the 16th.
Were you going to punish those who were there on the morning of or the afternoon of the 16th with what may have been done on the Monday and the previous week?
There's no strategy within the police to punish people. That is not within the jurisdiction of the police to act in that way.
You refer to what happened the previous week and what happened on Monday.
That arrest?
The situation that you were confronting was on your own evidence and on the other evidence by other witnesses. This was a peaceful gathering.
Peaceful gathering attended by a substantial number of people who had dangerous weapons and were contravening the law. I say it's a substantial number, not all of them by any manner of means. A substantial number of them had dangerous weapons and were contravening other laws relating to the possession of dangerous weapons, and were not exercising their rights of assembly in a peaceful fashion. That's the point, as I understand.
That's right, Chairperson.
Are you saying that a contravention of the Assemblies Act, even though some of them may be armed with traditional weapons, that gives the police a right to kill 34 people?
There's no killing because of a contravention of a gathering or with illegal arms. The contravention is response to what those police members felt was a threat on them at that time. And at no time was that a planned action on behalf of the police to go to kill anybody. The planned action was simply to disperse. And understanding dispersal doesn't mean physical action. It means first verbal warning, so that those that don't want to be there and understand what is coming, because part of the warning is simply to also explain to the strikers what the tactical option of the use of force is going to be. And in that aspect, there's no punishment. It is simply a tactical option which is agreed upon as part of a standard operating procedure within the public order domain as a method to get a crowd to comply, to bring them back within the legal instructions or the legal expectations.
Also state at 627, the other alternative which could dictate police action would be if all other options to resolve the situation without force were exhausted and there was no other means to restore order to the area but to bring the strikers back in line with the legal requirement for lawful protests. Do you adhere to that?
Yes, I do. One must just put that use of force into perspective. It's the force continuum when talking of strikers here of the public order policing domain.
Can we perhaps take a comfort break at this point for 5 minutes for those who in need thereof? And you can proceed with the cross-examination thereafter. Commission will resume. Sometimes these breaks take a bit longer than we expect, but I'm sure if they're necessary, they have to be taken. You're still under oath, Colonel? Mr. Bezos.
Mr. Chairman. Colonel, I want to read to you a passage in paragraph 52.16 of your statement, H20.
Get the reference, Mr. Bezos. Forgive me. Could you repeat it?
Yes.
I know the statement. Which paragraph?
H20.
20. Thank you.
52.16.
Page 146 of the exhibit.
Yes. No. 52:16. I must add that the fact that the strikers had chosen the copy as a congregation point was a positive. They would, on the copy, not be a threat to life or property. Did you say that?
That is my opinion, that while they were on that copy, unless there was fighting which broke out amongst themselves, there was no property to be destroyed or people that opposed them, so that was a good place for them to be.
There is a considerable body of evidence that the problem was viewed by some, the continuation of the strike. Would you agree that if this evidence is accepted wholly or in part, that that was no ground to use force or kill people in order to put an end to the strike?
I'm not too clear on the question in that.
The question's a bit vague, but I think I understand what Mr. Bezos is trying to say. There is a suggestion, that one of the motives for the action taken was to break the strike. There's in fact been some evidence that one of the persons concerned actually said we're going to break the strike. We don't have to go into whether that perception is correct, but that was a perception on the part of at least one of the actors, that's what, to some extent, was what the operation was all about. Now, what Mr. Bezos is putting to you is, would you agree that that would be, as I understand him, that would be an incorrect perception, that the operation that you planned and the operation that it was intended to implement was not designed to break the strike, but presumably to restore law and order and prevent the ongoing danger of the possibility of sharp weapons being used against people in illegal circumstances. That's my summary of the question. That's your question, Mr. Bezos.
From my understanding, the police were there, nothing to do with the strike action itself. If the strike was a peaceful strike, it would have continued, whether protected or unprotected. We are simply there when the law and the order is threatened, and our role there was to bring back those that were contravening law back to within the law, utilizing as best possible tolerance, dialogue, speaking, etc. The fact that it goes to a place where a tactical option is now necessary to be employed is a decision-making process for that matter, which is above my authority. However, it's not necessary to say that I disagree on that day, because the perceptions I had on that day again were that the threat level had been raised against what was going on, that dialogue had no longer any place, because nobody was going to come to speak to the strikers, and the police now needed to move to a position where they needed to break up the gathering, which was illegal, not the strike.
A contravention of been part of a strike is hardly a reason for killing people.
I'm not sure that even being part of the strike is necessarily a contravention, but anyway, that's not what the witness is saying, but are you just getting him to confirm that what you're putting is correct?
Yeah. Will you? What is your response?
Again, with regard to a strike, you've got the right to strike, protected or unprotected, and there are certain labour laws that which would enable that through the unions, etc., and the way it goes. The police are not there to deal with the labour issues. We were there to deal with the safety and security of the environment.
Yes.
So the considerations around the police actions were based on that.
You correctly said that there has to be threat to life or property.
That was one of the
Place to intervene.
That was one of the precepts, that the police are, there's an onus on the police force, even according to the Constitution,
Yes.
that we need to intervene when there is a threat to life, for that matter, an illegal threat to life or damage to property. The police are expected to act, but that was only one of the, at some stage, because of the illegality of the gathering, because it was armed, the police would have the onus to try to exhaust all other measures and then come in to as a last resort with a tactical option to try to disperse that and take away those arms from the strikers and try to retrieve, for that matter, the firearms that were stolen from the deceased. So that had to be part of the planning process, and obviously because it's part of a planning process, it had to be part of the operation should it be got to. But when it gets got to is not necessarily something that I could answer to.
Well, did you consider that you didn't have to wait for the 3,000 to gather and that you may disarm them before they got there in the morning?
Yes, that was a consideration as early as the Tuesday already. However, as I say, Tuesday we weren't ready, we weren't in place yet. Many of the police members from around the country and the surrounding provinces that had been called in had not arrived and were not there, thus adequately briefed on that initial plan. But it was a consideration. But once we started with dialogue on the Tuesday, the dialogue took us successfully into Wednesday, with the protesters or the strikers making the arrangement on the Tuesday afternoon to meet the police there the next day to continue with the dialogue. The police dialogue already came to an end on the Wednesday, if I understand correctly, from the negotiator. But what kept the hopes alive was the fact that at a strategic level, the dialogue with the union presidents, which General Mpembe was arranging, remained a hope. That took us through to the Thursday again. But after that had failed, there was no longer any hope left, and nobody else wanted to speak labour to the strikers per se. And the police could not allow this thing to run indefinitely, because at that stage we didn't know what the next reaction of the striking group was going to be.
On the morning of the 16th, somebody wrote down D-Day. Who did it? Whose handwriting is it on the exhibit that has been produced?
My understanding.
D-Day.
My understanding is that it is an advocate. She's an advocate, but she holds the rank of colonel.
Captain, then now Colonel Millman.
Millman, yes.
Who's an admitted advocate and
yes.
Police legal advisor or officer.
Yes.
Do you agree that the expression D-Day is a military term?
I know that it was a military term in the Second World War, but I know that it's become a common terminology to say that today something could happen. I think
Do
it's
you
used
agree
in a wider,
that it is a military term?
amongst others, it is a military term, but it is used
Yes.
in wider society as
How
well.
did you understand it when she said it as a military term?
She took the notes, but I don't recall it being said.
Beg your pardon?
She didn't say it. She took the notes down, but I don't
But
recall it being said.
She took a note. Who used the words?
He didn't hear the words being used. So I don't know that he can answer the question. You say you never heard those words being used.
No, Chairperson.
They appear from the notes to have occurred right at the beginning of the meeting.
Yes.
Were you there at the very beginning of the meeting?
I should have been. I've checked my phone records. There were times where I was making SMSs with regard to the Air Force chopper. So it may also contribute to parts of the meeting that I was not there, because they'd have made an arrangement not to come in that Thursday. And I was making the arrangements with them. If not coming in, then at least you need to be on X amount of standby, and how long will it take you? And
Similar words were used by, or words to that effect, were used by the Deputy Commissioner.
You mean the Provincial Commissioner? I think you mean the Provincial
Captain
Commissioner.
Adrian.
I'm not sure the Provincial Commissioner used them. Captain Adria is quoted at some stage as having said that
using
after
those
her
words.
media conference, I think.
Yes, but the Deputy Commissioner,
You mean the Provincial Commissioner? You mean General Mbombo?
yes,
She's the Provincial Commissioner.
the Provincial Commissioner, used words of a similar meaning, that today we will finish this off. Isn't that what D-Day means?
I think it's open for interpretation. What is the speaker of the words meaning? But as I understand that the Provincial Commissioner didn't use that terminology. She did, as I've heard in the video that was shown in the Commission, say that today this must end, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure I'm speaking verbatim.
Today we are ending this matter, I'm reminded the precise words were.
Yes, it's quite possible.
D-Day means.
It's one of the expressions. D-Day obviously means yes.
So that the decision to put an end to the presence of the people, in the opinion of the Provincial Commissioner, and whoever may have used the expression D-Day early in the morning of the 16th, was decided upon hours before the alleged behavior of the crowd that made it necessary to use lethal force.
Chairperson, we have been cautious not to be objecting. We are way outside the areas which, by agreement, were supposed to be dealt with by Mr. Bezos.
Mr. Bezos, there is substance in that objection, is there not?
I respect my learned friend's objection, but I think that it's a vital question that I should be allowed to put to the witness with your chairmanship's leave.
Are you got any other questions after this?
There are a few.
On other matters? On matters covered by your application?
Yes.
Well, I'll allow the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Please give an answer, because it's vital, isn't it? Isn't it a vital answer? Inconsistent.
I think you should give us the answer. Whether it's vital is a matter that can be argued later.
I think I've testified. I'm not sure what the question was again, but if it's regarding the decision that's taken earlier that day, that it must end today, the Provincial Commissioner at that stage is also hoping that this is still going to be resolved through dialogue. It's a policing matter, and I can't speak for her, but as a police person, you don't go forward with ideas of killing people as you've been putting forward. The idea is to deal with the situation as proportionately as possible, with the lowest threat levels obviously as possible to your own forces who need to go forward to carry out a tactical option if necessary, to disperse the crowds, to get them away, to break up this illegal gathering, and thereafter, obviously, to make the necessary arrests, to try and retain weapons that were possibly used in the acts of murder, and retrieve those that were stolen from deceased people. That was, in essence, where one was going with that I can understand that she would have wanted to move towards as well.
I think this was covered extensively in Mr. Chaskalson's cross-examination.
Yes.
So to some extent, to a substantial extent, I think you're repeating that cross-examination.
Well,
if there's some angle that's...
we will
but
leave it...
the point's been made, isn't it really a matter for argument?
We will leave it to argue, Mr. Chairman. Colonel, why do you think you were chosen to plan this operation?
Obviously, that question would be best answered by the person that called me, which was General Annandale, and I think he was asked that question, to which he did answer it within the transcript. But I wouldn't be able to express his views of why he called me specifically. I can give my opinion on that, but it wouldn't reflect his view necessarily.
You have said that you have been involved in operation involved fatalities. Involving fatalities.
Yes, in essence, the Special Task Force is the last bastion within the police when it comes to dealing with the most extreme high-risk situations where there is precision policing necessary, tactics necessary, to deal specifically with hostage release operations, and then what we do consider high-risk operations within the country, where the police, normal policing, would find themselves not capable of dealing with that effectively.
You want to name them?
Are we talking the operations?
Operations in which there were fatalities?
Well, you would ask me now to go back over many years of policing, but...
Just give us two or three of the most recent ones. That will surely be enough for the questioner.
There have been... Well, these are obviously where there have been fatalities, but there's been numerous where there haven't been fatalities, for that matter, where we've executed our task without any destruction to property or loss of life on either side. But there is cash in transit robberies that I've been involved in, when there have been casualties, more than one for that matter, where we normally arrive on scene when the shooting from the perpetrator's side, the robbers, is already underway on the cash vans and on the security guards within those cash vans. And when we move in essence, the shooting turns directly towards us, where we then need to defend ourselves. And that has led to loss of life.
Well, those skills or experience or expertise are not relevant to management control, are they?
I'm not understanding the question,
I think
Chairperson.
you mean crowd control. You mean crowd control or crowd management?
Crowd management.
I'm still not sure how to
The question
place
is
fatalities
your expertise derived from these operations where there were fatalities, these high-risk operations that you were involved in. That expertise and experience, Mr. Bezos is suggesting to you, isn't an expertise that is necessary or appropriate to use in a crowd management context. Is that your question, Mr. Bezos?
What I can state, though, as you said, you've asked for operations where fatalities have been, and the expertise that I have lies in trying not to have fatalities at all, if possible. But that is normally because of an action towards us, driven by the perpetrator, which causes a response from ourselves. But in saying this, I've done possibly hundreds of operations where we do effecting of high-risk warrants of arrest, going into the very premises of a very well-known criminal that the police could normally not go to, and we would need to exercise the warrant of arrest on behalf of the detectives. And we execute our duty because of the tactics we utilize and so on, that the actual utilization of our firearms is minimal in those. And that experience ties in again, amongst others, with numerous other operations that we conduct in the open area environment with Marikana, with regard to the Special Task Force, the National Intervention Unit, and the Tactical Response Teams, on how we effect high-risk arrests in dealing with confrontation with hostile or belligerent persons that need to be arrested, whether that be inside a structure like a house or whether that be outside of a structure where many criminals tend to run to in KwaZulu-Natal, into the hills and so on, where we need to track them down. So that confrontation there is also something that we've evolved tactics around, which is why I implied that those units at Marikana needed to be able to exercise those skills in the carrying out of the high-risk arresting of belligerent or armed protesters.
You record that you got a certificate of commendation from the National Commissioner for the apprehension of cash in transit robbers in 2007. Which incident was that?
That was an incident near the Carousel. I think it's a casino area to the north of Pretoria, where I think it was 12 were arrested on scene. The group was larger than 12, but there were 12 that were confronted on scene. Were attacking a cash in transit van, and the Special Task Force with the detectives responded.
Chair, unless particularly relevant.
I was wondering the same.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the safety of
Are you taking this one any further, Mr. Bezos, if you've got the point you want?
Yes, there is a vital question that I would like to ask, Mr. Chairman.
Let's hear it.
How many were killed?
Of the people that were on scene, of the perpetrators that were on scene, 11 of the 12.
11 out of the 12.
Yes.
Isn't that a very distinguishable situation?
Well, it is, but
or taken on face value.
What makes it so?
The reason why I'm asking you the question is, but I don't want to enter into the details, that there were questions asked as to whether some of them had their hands up when they were killed.
That's the first I hear of that. But again,
the first you hear of it.
Yes. Again, that is the people that utilize.
But you will agree, will you not, that you have already done that sort of situation is different to a situation such as this?
It's obviously different. It's a different operation. It's a totally different type of operation.
I want to go back to my original question about our Constitution. And ask you this. I have called it political rhetoric in the past. The decision whether it was yours or the person in charge of the police that actually did the shooting were influenced by the political rhetoric which seeks to reverse what was decided in 1994 about the management of gatherings, by saying that the police must shoot to kill, and the other expressions by politicians, some members of the public and others, which amount to a negation of the constitutional principles that the Constitutional Court and the police are obliged to follow. Does that, in your opinion, may have influenced the people that pull the trigger?
So, obviously I can only speak for myself, but if I do reflect onto the police officials involved, I don't think it did. And I've often been known to say that I serve the legal aspect of our country. I'm within the police and I serve the criminal justice system. And if comments are made, if that is what you're referring to, by possibly previous national commissioners or ministers or so on, that doesn't affect my decision making, because I do understand that there is a law that we abide by, and that law is entrusted to me to be an enforcer of it. So I can't be a contravener of the very same law I'm expected to enforce, and I've always walked my path in that way, that I serve the legal justice system and not necessarily a political party or political viewpoint of the day.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know whether it is covered or not, but there is a question, and my last question that I want to ask about Exhibit L.
Yes, it's not covered, but if it's your last question, I'll let you ask it.
Thank you. Colonel, I want to quote a very prominent pathologist, Dr. Jonathan Blackman, who during the apartheid years gave evidence in numerous inquests. He said that a dead body may be a better witness than those that may be alive. Prompted by that statement of his in a court case, in an inquest, what I want to ask you is this: that when you put together Exhibit L, did you have regard to the medical and ballistics evidence that has been placed by the Legal Resources Center before the Commission?
I don't recall seeing any, if you're talking post-mortem.
State pathologists, the state pathologists in particular, was it available to you? Post-mortem.
I know that we got from Colonel Botha, we would have got post-mortems. Obviously, we reflect some of them with regard to the 13th. The killings of the 13th are reflected in the presentation Exhibit L. I'm not sure at what stage the remainder were made available with regard to the deaths on the 16th.
I'm not concerned with the 13th. I'm concerned with the question on the 16th.
I don't know
were those postmortems put before you finalized Exhibit L?
If I looked at any post-mortem issues, I would have only been looking at the photograph evidence thereof, and I can't recall doing that because I didn't need that for the presentation as far as I could recall. There were photographs taken of deceased on scene, which were the ones we reflected. The only reason that there were photographs placed on the Monday the 13th was because we didn't have photographs of specifically some of those members on scene.
If they had been put in before you, might they have been influenced the composition of Exhibit L?
No, I don't think they would have. If you're talking now from the pathology report.
Well, Exhibit L is on the premise that the shooting was in self-defense.
That's my understanding from the people that have spoken to me, yes.
But the findings of the pathologist, I'm going to put to you, negate that allegation, because most of the people were shot either in the back or on the side.
Chair, there's no way a finding of a pathologist can negate anything.
So I think the question is put too strongly. I agree with Mr. Semenya, subject to what you can say, that negate's too strong a word. The fact that a number of the deceased were shot in the back would be a factor in deciding whether they indeed were shot in circumstances of self-defense or private defense. Now, was that material available to you, indicating? I think IPID had the post-mortem reports.
I think before that, sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Chairman. Before that question, Mr. Bezos, you've put this question before, and when we looked at the reports that you had handed in, there were, I think, 6 or 7 only of the deceased that were shot on the back and the side. So the question can't be that most of the deceased were shot in the back.
What can be asked, I suppose, is if you had known that some of the deceased, at least, according to the post-mortem reports done by the state pathologist, had been shot in the back or in the side. And that was a factor which might or might not throw light on the question whether they were killed in circumstances of self-defense or private defense. Firstly, did that material come before you when Exhibit L was being compiled?
I'm just trying to think when it was, but I think it was after Exhibit L was compiled that we got to see some form of who had been shot where. But I think that was later in November, if I'm not mistaken.
Next question I think Mr. Bezos is asking you is if it had come, it's a hypothetical question. Some witnesses don't answer hypothetical questions. But if it had come before you at the time of the roots exercise, these post-mortem reports, which revealed that some at least of the deceased had been shot in the back, would that have been included in Exhibit L? Are you able to answer that?
Chairperson, and I think it's common knowledge that there are bodies which cannot be claimed per se at scene 2. And the perception is, and I think it's even mentioned possibly by some of the persons that said they shot towards the bushes, that one would expect that possibly some of the rounds they fired, if it is, but this is where there obviously needs to be objective proof to that, could have hit people in the side or possibly in the back. And I am aware of one incident where the 2 police members didn't even know, where a certain member was standing on top of the rocks coming over the top, and he saw an armed striker move out towards one of the K9 members who were in the bush. And he actually shouted out, and as far as we know, they both shot him. So one was firing in private defense, the other in self-defense. Some rounds would have been coming from the back and some from the front, for that matter. So, and these 2 statements actually got linked when we were trying to put scene 2 together.
I haven't answered the question. The question Mr. Bezos wants to know, I think, is if you'd had that material, would it have been put into Exhibit L as far as you know? Question, Mr. Bezos?
No, I wouldn't have, because I've seen that, for instance, the person that was shot with pellets, where those pellets came from, I can't say. But I saw that. I've seen photos of that on scene. But no one speaks to that. The only reports that were given to us were of self or private defense. So that's what I reflected, because nobody's come to say. So we only reflected what we were told.
Mr. Chairman, I'm assured by the people sitting to the left and the right of me that the figures that I gave were substantially correct, but we will call the pathologists and the number will be determined.
Well, it's a matter for argument. I think the exhibits are before the Commission anyway. So
the last
anyway, the witness dealt with on the basis that some at least were shot in the back, and he gave an answer.
The other is that the people that the majority of the people that were shot but survived were shot in the back or the side. Was that information before you? before putting Exhibit L together?
I got at some stage, and I'm not sure if this was also around the time of the post-mortems that we got to review most of this. But again, so I can't say whether it was there when we were doing Exhibit L. We were aware that there were a lot of wounded, and I can't, again, recall exactly at what time, but I think what was conveyed to us that many of the injuries were in the feet, the upper legs, etc. And my perception of that, and it will be shown in Exhibit L, where I drew the actual lines of where the TRT was standing, was to show that obviously when you're firing at what you think is the threat in front of you, bullets that miss the front people are continuing with their line of flight. Thus, you would find that there were some people shot on the opposite side of the kraal, possibly from the fire going through the kraal, and those then respectively behind them would also have received or been part of a collateral damage because of the threat posed that the police were responding to in front of them.
You were supposed to have a debriefing in terms of the standing orders.
Mr. Bezos, A, you've asked your last question. B, the debriefing, the non-holding of the debriefing, the decision taken not to have a debriefing, that's all been covered in evidence before, and this witness, in any event, as I recall, was not a party to the decision not to have a debriefing in terms of standing order. So I don't know with respect that asking him the question is going to help us at all.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman. I have no further questions.
It's now just after 1 o'clock. We had intended carrying on this afternoon and tomorrow, but for reasons that I don't have to state, it's not possible for us to do that. And we will now adjourn until 9 o'clock on Monday morning.